some of our guests from that nation, is a man who's kept a keen eye on events ever since leaving his position as the U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for Africa, and that's Diplomat. He's now adjunct professor at Texas Tech University. So what role, if any, can be played by the United States, the United Nations, or other Western countries to help resolve the conflict in Cameroon? Greetings to you, former Ambassador Nash. Thank you very much for joining us. If I can ask you, sir, we heard the former government minister, Professor Ngwele, say the solution should come from within, but others say international pressure should be applied so that President Biya and his government enters direct talks with all parties in this conflict. What is your view on that, please?
Thanks for having me, Bola, and good afternoon. Actually, the answer to that is yes and yes. Obviously, the final resolution has to come from within the various parties in Cameroon, but there also needs to be intense international pressure. Otherwise, the Cameroonian government will just go through a process of having a process with no clear outcomes. So indeed, the international community needs to apply more pressure, but also the Cameroonians, all of the sides, need to fix their own positions because the government is divided on what to do about it, but also the Anglophone communities are very much divided on how to move forward.
Yeah, and you've also gone on record, if I may say, sometimes criticizing some of the attitudes displayed by even some within government. For instance, in November, you were saying, you talked in response to an article that somebody else said about the role of President Biya and how he's been. And if I recall, you said that, that what needs to be done is for all the guns to stop, but that if the current government carries on with its current policies, it will speed up the creation of Ambazonia. And you said pacification means bringing peace, not scorched earth. Can you describe what you mean by that?
Yeah, absolutely. Number one, anyone who says that Cameroon's Anglophone population is not second-class citizens, I will just point to one key fact. You have a president of Cameroon who's been president for 38 years, and he does not speak English. Can you imagine a Canadian prime minister not speaking French? So that's one. Number two, when this struggle started and the Anglophones aired their grievances, the support for an independent Ambazonia, I would say, was a minor point of view. But as the conflict goes on, there are more and more Anglophones who are coming to the side of wanting an independent Ambazonia. So the government, if it keeps up the scorched earth, it will end up just like what happened with South Vietnam. We have seen it in other places in the world, that they're going to drive the Anglophones into the more extreme position, and that there will end up with being two Cameroons, one Ambazonia and the other one what is now Francophone Cameroon.
Ambassador Diplomat, if I may ask you, because also the government has spoken out quite openly about the activities of NGOs, sometimes saying that they're being used by the separatist fighters. When you hear that kind of rhetoric and know what people are suffering on the ground, the civilians, we've seen over 1 million displaced, how can you convince the government, though, that when you make that kind of criticism about them and their attitudes, that you're not siding also, as they would accuse, with the separatists or those who pursue or support that view?
Well, here's the other governments, as we all know, accuse NGOs of taking side X or side Y. And here's the truth. I have worked with NGOs for my decades of being in Africa, and they are incredibly faithful, devoted people going into the worst possible circumstances. Now, you're an NGO and you're treating women who have been raped. Of course, your sympathy is going to be with the victims. And that's what happens to NGOs, whether they're working in refugee camps or areas that are under conflict. You have to have sympathy for the victims, which does not mean that you're sympathizing with the political objectives, but you're definitely sympathizing with the victim. But this is an old criticism that governments always bring out about NGOs.
And in a word, do you think your own government, that President Biden at the moment is spending as much time concentrating on the conflict in Cameroon, which many people say is a forgotten conflict, even though it's been going on for almost 5 years?
It is a forgotten conflict, and there are several reasons for that. One, there are huge issues which push themselves to the front of the international agenda. And as we all know, there's only 24 hours in the day and so much oxygen in the room, and they suck it out. You know, whether it's Afghanistan, Iran, Ukraine, Taiwan, China. So those are the ones that grab the attention. The Cameroonian conflict, another reason is that France, who is critical, and French role is critical, has been very, very ambivalent about wanting to do anything with Cameroon. And as you all know, Cameroon also is in a very unique position because there's two crises going on in Cameroon. One, of course, the Anglophone crisis, but there's also a crisis in northern Cameroon, which involves international extremism. And in that crisis, the Cameroonian government is an ally of the international community and trying to confront the extremism. So there are all of these complicating factors, but the answer to your question is absolutely yes. The conflict needs more attention, but I can't guarantee that it'll get it.
Ambassador Naj, thank you very much for joining us today, this evening or afternoon for you there in the United States. And from the United States, we head back to Cameroon, where we're joined now from Kinin Som, who's a journalist, editor of the Post newspaper. Because how do you, as someone in the media, cover conflict which is being seen in different ways by whichever side you look at it? Numerous journalists have been arrested. They faced harassment. Others have quit their careers altogether over increasing threats for their lives. So for a little insight, let's speak now to Kinin Som. Evening to you, Kini. Thank you very much for joining us from Yaoundé. How would you describe, if you may, the crisis which has racked the Anglophone region?
This is the most unfortunate anti-people crisis that have ever been fought in the world. It was so trivial a crisis that could have been settled over a fireside chat. But we've seen that the arch victims of this crisis are the unarmed civilians. You know that there have been the burning down of whole villages, there have been extrajudicial killings, there have been kidnappings, and all the victims are civilians. So that's why I call it an anti-people crisis, and it's really unfortunate because the belligerents, both sides claim to be fighting for the people, but they're the people that are suffering this crisis for the past 5 years.
And it's interesting, as you say, because it's both sides, both the government and the Ambazonian separatists, who've been accused by human rights organizations of atrocities, of killings, and as you say, it is the civilians that are paying the price for this conflict. Can you describe some of the challenges you've faced from both either the government or even the separatists?
I think it's, for any reporter, it's very challenging. It's a very dicey situation to cover the crisis objectively, because everybody, both sides of the divide, the belligerents, any one of them want you to tell their own side of the story to sustain the propaganda. So it's very difficult for the journalist. I would say that it is the most underreported crisis because sometimes it's difficult to balance a story. If you get it from the other end, the other side treats you like, as if you are an enemy. For instance, if there are extrajudicial killings by the soldiers and you are trying to get the story to verify it from the other side, is a difficult situation. And sometimes we rely on secondary sources that are not very, to be fully trusted. So it's challenging for the reporter to balance the story, getting it from both sides of the divide. And you can say when in that kind of situation where access to information is difficult, you can also imagine the quality of journalism that we are practicing as far as the coverage of the crisis is concerned.
And briefly,
but I will speak for the mainstream media.
Kini, one thing also that we heard earlier, sorry for interrupting, from some students at Yaoundé University, they said, especially those who are from Francophone Cameroon, were saying sometimes there's ignorance in their region from what's happening in the Anglophone, and some people feel they're exaggerating what's happening there.
If I'm speaking for the mainstream media that has been doing quite a wonderful job, trying to be objective even in the midst of difficulties. I would say that there is, from the very beginning, the Francophone press was not very interested in covering the crisis. But as the situation exacerbated, they came in because they saw the magnitude of human rights abuses and the extrajudicial killings especially that were taking place. So any reporter who is worth the sword would discover that that is new. So they came in. And I want to say that the press is really divided in covering the crisis. One, you have the pro-establishment press that will sing their own song all the time without caring about the facts, what is happening in the field. And you also have the anti-establishment press that would sustain the propaganda of the other side. But I say that there is the mainstream media that is trying to be objective, trying to look at both sides of the divide so that they report the crisis and give it a true picture.
Thank you.
Often there are intimidations. Yes.
Right, working against so many challenges.
There are intimidations because...
And we do apologize that we can't hear more about the intimidation that you face, but hopefully we'll be able to put a longer version of the interview with you online. But Kinin Som, thank you very much for joining us from Yaoundé. And you would